My name is Harlan Beckley, and I am the Executive Director of the Shepherd Higher Education Program on Poverty, Consortium on Poverty. Glad to have you all here this morning. I wanted to begin by introducing you to one of our good friends from VMI, Colonel James Turner, who is head of the biology department and head of the service committee, and in virtue of that last position, we've been able to work together quite a bit in the last few years, and we look forward to continuing to work together. VMI has been such a gracious co-host for us this weekend, and I'm like Fran, it's not the weekend anymore. And we're so gracious, we're so grateful to have them join us and be a part of this consortium closing conference. But Colonel Turner is going to welcome us to VMI.
As I say to my students so very early in the morning, good morning, young geniuses. Now that gets their attention. Now whether it's true or not, I'll never tell them but for some others in the audience, good morning, older geniuses. But that term is not used lightly today with this august group, of course. You young interns who have returned after giving your genius to your various service groups around the country are certainly wonderful representatives of this group of academics that are moving the awareness of poverty and the elimination of poverty forward. So VMI welcomes you. VMI is delighted to be a partner with Washington and Lee in bringing forth over the last several years these wonderful opening and closing conferences, and this conference is no exception. VMI is delighted to offer its facilities. You're in the Center for Leadership and Ethics, also known as Marshall Hall, in name of one of our esteemed graduates, George C. Marshall, who you may have read about in the history of World War II and afterwards, and what he did to bring up and uplift those in need after the Second World War. So we're delighted to offer facilities and resources to help with this conference. We are very serious at VMI with regards to the concept of service. It is a centerpiece of our mission statement. And this past year, we had over 900 of our cadets engaged in service opportunities, from ministering to a small community in Bolivia in the Andes to bring portable water to their small community, to things such as assisting in the Special Olympics. We are proud that we want to graduate those citizens who have that conscious level as you do of service within their communities for the rest of their lives. To that end, VMI will be hosting, I am told that I must give note, and rightly so, to a conference that VMI is hosting in March, a national conference on the title Honor in Service, Responding to the Needs of Our Time, Global Health, Poverty, and Human Rights. We would invite you all to this conference in March to participate, either as members of the audience or those presenting papers and posters. This conference is a special time of the century for us at VMI, because centered around this conference will be the celebration of the martyrdom of one of our graduates, Jonathan Daniels, who heeded the call of Martin Luther King in the early 60s as a young Episcopal seminarian to help in the civil rights movement, and made the ultimate sacrifice to that group or groups of people that he was serving in the South to step in front of a shotgun blast that surely would have resulted in the murder of those who he had pledged to serve. And so this will be the 50th, 2015 will be the 50th year of that martyrdom. And so Jonathan Daniels, along with Martin Luther King, are now martyrs of the Episcopal Church. And so we would welcome you to that conference and would be joyous in your participation. In ending, I will offer a special blessing to our interns as you move into your communities. Offer your genius to others, your energy, your enthusiasm, and your recruitment to this glorious effort of eradicating poverty around us. Thank you, and God bless you.
Allow me to add one thing. If you have time, and especially this is true of those of us from this community who spend our time here, go down to behind the barracks in the courtyard, to the Jonathan Daniels courtyard, and spend a few minutes there learning a little bit more about Jonathan Daniels. It's a wonderful experience. And it's been there for, what, Jim, five years or so? And it's a place to spend a little silent time. You should go. And we will also be continuing to publicize the March conference on the websites at Washington Lee and on the consortium website, so keep track of that as well. A couple announcements. We want to continue to remind you that you do have both printed and electronic assessments that we would like you to fill out. Please, please, please. And they're long, but we don't expect you to fill out every question. Those that you have comments on or can say something helpful about, please do that, if you will. And there also is an assessment survey from the University of Notre Dame about the internship that takes much less time and is more of a straightforward evaluation. Please do that as well. For others of us, there will be a brief meeting in the left-hand corner of the Hall of Valor after our session this morning to talk about pedagogical collaboration and pedagogical methods. Toddy Peters from Elon will be leading that group, and some people I know have to leave that would like to be involved in that meeting. You should be in touch with me or with even more directly with Rebecca Todd Peters at Elon or LaWanda Evans at Millsaps College, who are leading that effort. And that's going to lead to more collaboration and more cooperation with regard to our courses in the Shepherd Consortium. I have the privilege of introducing somebody whom I've known for quite some time now, the Robert L. Willett Family Professor of Law, Tim Jost. And Tim doesn't encourage long introductions. He's a pretty humble guy, actually. So I don't want to counter his wishes, at least not in the length, but I do want to say something about how important it is that we have Tim here to talk with us this morning about the Affordable Care Act and low-income Americans. After consulting with a few colleagues in the consortium, I thought this is a perfect time for us to focus on the ACA, sometimes called Obamacare, more properly called the Affordable Care Act, or the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and its relationship to impoverished citizens. It didn't take me long to think about who would be a great speaker for this occasion. So I wrote my friend and colleague Tim Jost, to invite him to speak. Washington Lee is very fortunate to have Tim Jost on its faculty. He's undoubtedly one of the nation's leading experts on healthcare law. He has co-written one of the leading texts on healthcare law in the United States. It's now in its 7th edition. But perhaps more importantly for this audience today, he has been much in demand to speak and write columns on the ACA in recent years. He speaks to inform and provide wisdom, which means that he has made special efforts to speak to a lot of groups on our campus where he receives no honorarium, but comes and interacts with students and helps to keep them informed about healthcare policy. Tim wants us to know how the ACA bears on the lives of human beings. You should also know that Tim combines his legal acumen with normative reasoning about the role of healthcare in the lives of our citizens and residents. He cares about the law and about how the law and healthcare itself impacts the lives of poor persons and families. He is a superb technician, as so far as I'm able to tell, but he's more than a mere technician of the law. I surmise that Tim's Mennonite heritage and active faith inform his professional expertise and enable him to bring wisdom as well as facts to this issue. Tim has spoken on the ACA many times this summer, and if you want to read his latest blog, you can check out Health Affairs, where he has a blog on the legal challenges to subsidies for federal exchanges, and that's last Friday. It's the latest blog I know about. There may be a later one, but that's the latest one I know about. This legal ruling will affect low-income families in about half the states in the United States, and I have no doubt that Tim, either in his talk or in the discussion that follows, will have something to say to us about how that legal challenge might bear on the ACA and on poor Americans. I'll add one more interesting fact before I let Tim take the podium. Tim's son, Micah, was a Shepherd intern. He attended Washington Lee Law School. So what we're talking about today is a family matter for Tim Jost. Tim, we're grateful you're here. Looking forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Harlan, and thank you all for coming out this morning to hear about the Affordable Care Act and its impact on America's poor. It's very hard to be poor in the United States. My wife has worked for some time with ex-offenders. These are often people who have been locked up for minor drug charges. Sometimes more serious offenses are involved, but rarely violent crimes. She works in our local jail. Often these people have been effectively imprisoned for debt, for failure to pay child support or fines. Often they are re-imprisoned for minor probation violations. What is striking is how hard it is for them to break back into society once they are released. Often imprisonment or failure to pay fines means the loss of a driver's license. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, to keep a job and get a job in Western Virginia. Loss of a driver's license can also make it hard to prove your identity, making it difficult for ex-offenders, for example, to open a bank account or even to cash a check. Employers are, of course, also reluctant to hire ex-offenders. Many applications for low-wage jobs are now handled online. An employer need never explicitly reject an application for ex-offender status, which might cause legal problems. The employer can simply fail to acknowledge it. One doesn't need to be imprisoned, however, to fall into the poverty trap. Falling behind on rent may result in an eviction. The eviction usually shows up on the evicted person's credit rating. Rental applications are now handled online rather than in person. An individual with an eviction on his or her record may never even receive a response to a housing application. If the individual was behind on utilities as well, restarting gas or electric service may require paying up all arrearages. A minimum wage job may not be enough to live on, particularly if it's part-time. If income cannot be stretched to the end of a pay period, an individual may need to resort to car title or in some states payday loans. Interest rates on these loans may equal an interest rate of 400% a year. Turnover on low-wage jobs is also high, and an individual who has to miss work because childcare arrangements fall through or a car breaks down can find him or herself unemployed again. Perhaps the worst thing that can happen to a poor individual, however, is to get sick. In all other developed countries, illness is regarded as a natural consequence of the human condition and a burden to be borne by society. Just as we believe everyone should be entitled to an elementary or secondary education and the opportunity afforded by education, all other developed countries believe that no one should lose out in life because they cannot afford health care. The approaches that other countries take to financing health care vary greatly, but each of them ensures that individuals with health care needs get at least access to hospital and physician services, and usually access to other basic medical services as well, with no cost or with affordable cost sharing. As you all know, in the United States, we have no comprehensive national health insurance program. We rather have a patchwork of programs that cover some people with some conditions some of the time. Most working-age Americans, including many lower-income Americans, receive health care through their employment. Although most of us don't think about it much, this coverage is heavily subsidized by the federal and state governments. Income that is spent on health insurance is not subject to income tax, Social Security tax, Medicare tax, federal unemployment tax, or state income tax. And the subsidy gets greater as income increases. A high-income executive with a Cadillac plan can get over half of his or her health care paid for by the federal government. Low-wage workers who are not offered health insurance by their employers get no benefits at all. Neither do the unemployed or the uninsured. So really for 60 years now, we've had a system where high-wage people get a government benefit, poor people miss out. We also do have government programs. We have Medicare, a federal program for individuals age 65 and over, and the long-term disabled. We have Medicaid, which helps elderly and disabled people with costs not covered by Medicare, and also covers poor children and sometimes their parents. The CHIP program covers children with incomes between 100 and 200% of poverty, and in some states with higher incomes. We also have the Indian Health Service for Native Americans, the Veterans Administration, which helps some veterans with some problems, the Ryan White program for people with AIDS, and other programs for other population groups. Some localities have community health centers that provide primary care for individuals with payment on a sliding scale. Some communities, including Lexington, have free clinics that provide care to some people for free. Some drug companies offer discount programs for some drugs. Tax-exempt hospitals offer financial assistance to low-income patients, although the discounts are often off the full charge of the hospital, which is far above what the hospitals actually get paid by insurers and by government programs. Finally, under the Federal Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTALA, provides that hospitals that receive Medicare and have emergency rooms must screen and stabilize individuals who show up in their emergency rooms regardless of their ability to pay. EMTALA is often misunderstood by Americans, although I think poor people understand it better than others. It does not require hospitals to provide services for nothing. Unless individuals are insured, covered by government programs, or determined eligible for financial assistance by the hospital, they must pay the full cost for the emergency care they receive. And that often is the full charge, which again is far more than the hospitals actually get paid by anybody else. And emergency room care is very expensive. Moreover, hospitals are only required to provide care in emergencies. If people need maintenance care for chronic conditions or ongoing treatment such as chemotherapy, it's not covered under EMTALA. What we have then are a series of tattered and torn safety nets, and many people fall through the cracks. What are the consequences of this? First, individuals often defer care and treatment because they cannot afford it. This may mean not seeing a doctor when they're ill or injured or not following up on recommended tests. It may mean not filling prescriptions for needed medications, including maintenance medication, or splitting pills to make them last longer. Deferring or foregoing care may mean lower productivity, increased absenteeism, and job loss. It may mean allowing a condition that could have been treated successfully early on to deteriorate until it becomes much more costly to treat or simply untreatable. It also means feeling miserable much of the time. But poor people who seek treatment may not be able to get it. Many healthcare providers now demand payment up front for non-emergent care or will not accept uninsured patients or patients, even sometimes patients with Medicaid. If poor individuals get treatment, however, they face medical debt. Medical debt can mean debt owed directly to providers, but often nowadays it means credit card debt if a poor person is fortunate enough to have a credit card, as many providers insist on payment up front by credit card. People with medical debt they cannot pay must cut other necessary expenditures and often must endure harassment from collection agencies, garnishments, and ruined credit ratings, which in turn make getting housing or other necessities more difficult. Many Americans simply give up. Medical debt is one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States. Whether poor people forego medical care or seek it and then cannot pay for it, their stress levels will inevitably increase. High stress, in turn, results in its own physical and mental complications. It can result in domestic violence or simply in a tense environment for raising children. This, in turn, may interfere with education and socialization, and so the problems get passed on to the next generation. So what does the Affordable Care Act do to address these problems? First and most importantly, it expands Medicaid. The roots of Medicaid go back to 1935 when Congress passed the first Social Security Act. That statute, which established a contributory federal pension system for the elderly, which has come to be known as Social Security, also created public assistance programs for the elderly, the blind, and families with dependent children. These were programs under which the federal government made grants to the states, which in turn provided assistance to needy persons. And I've been doing a little research again, I've done this before, into the history of the Social Security Act. And we did get this uniform federal program which became Social Security, and then eventually Medicare was added on to that. And that's a federal program. The public assistance programs were left with the states instead of a national program being created. And I was reading again the book written by Edmund Witt, who was one of the drafters of the Social Security Act. And he said that the Southern senators insisted on that because they didn't want federal government interference in the management of the Negro question in the South. This is the tradition we continue to live with state-based Medicaid programs. And it's a tradition that I wish we could leave behind. Public assistance for the disabled followed later. In 1950, Congress made limited funds available to the states for vendor payments for medical care for people receiving financial assistance. In 1960, the Kerr-Mills Act extended medical coverage for the elderly, as well as creating a program for the medically needy, elderly persons who had income above the public assistance levels but had medical spending obligations that consumed their income. In 1965, Congress created Medicaid, which was really an extension of the Kerr-Mills statute. These statutes all built on each other, going back to what I would say would be the original sin in 1935. Medicaid provided grants to the states for medical care for persons who qualified for public assistance under the pre-existing programs, which is to say, the elderly, disabled, blind, and families with dependent children. The scope of Medicaid coverage has steadily expanded in the decade since 1965 to cover elderly, blind, and disabled individuals who receive federal supplemental security income, pregnant women, children and families with incomes up to 100% of poverty level, women with breast cancer, and numerous small categories of persons who cannot afford health care. In the interim, the state cash assistance programs on which Medicaid was originally based have been repealed, delinking Medicaid from its original linkage to cash welfare programs. The ACA completed the transformation of Medicaid from a simple adjunct to state public welfare programs to a program providing health insurance for all poor Americans. Although the Supreme Court in the Affordable Care Act case in 2012 described this as a radical change in the nature of the program, in fact, it was a natural extension of Medicaid as the program had evolved over the years. By far the best known change that the Affordable Care Act made in the Medicaid program was to expand its coverage to all adults under age 65 who are not pregnant or otherwise covered under Medicaid, and to all children with incomes not exceeding 133% of the poverty level, and this was supposed to happen on January 1st, 2014. In fact, the law requires state Medicaid programs to disregard the first 5 percentage points of income, so the eligibility level is really 138% of poverty. The federal medical assistance percentage, the amount that the federal government contributes to state Medicaid programs, which is normally from 50 to 80%, was increased for this group of adults and children to 100% of contribution for 2014, 100% federal money, 15 and 16, and then 95% for 2015, 94% for 2018, 93% for 2019, and then finally 90% for 2020 and thereafter. States that already covered, and I should say that although there's been a lot of debate of this, of course, in Virginia and other states, although the state will eventually have to pay 10% of the cost, the federal government in expanding Medicaid is also taking over a lot of expenses that states currently pay for incarcerated persons, for mental health, as well as expanding jobs and thus state taxes. So many people believe that even when the state is contributing 10%, it will be revenue neutral. States that already covered the expansion population will receive assistance initially at lower levels, but this will gradually climb to 90% of the poverty level. 90% federal participation. The reconciliation bill also increased funding for the territories. The law not only changed Medicaid eligibility requirements, it also altered the benefit package. Medicaid programs need not cover all of the same services for the expansion population that they do for other recipients, but must rather provide what's called benchmark or benchmark equivalent coverage for this population. Coverage must include at least the minimum essential benefits required for private plans under the reforms, and with limited exceptions must meet mental health parity requirements. In fact, regulations implementing the ACA require states to designate benchmark plans to identify coverage for the individual and small group market, which are usually, the plans are usually one of the most popular small group plans in the state. Medicaid benchmark population coverage for the expansion population is usually similar, although states can use different benchmarks for coverage than the benchmark the state uses for private plans. But usually Medicaid coverage is going to be very similar to private plan coverage under the ACA. States were allowed to cover the expansion population for 2014, but had to make lower income subclasses eligible before higher income subclasses. A number of states did this, and as of January 1st of this year, states had already covered 950,000 new eligibles under the Affordable Care Act before the expansion even kicked in. States were also generally obligated to maintain pre-existing Medicaid eligibility standards from the date of enactment in 2010 until an exchange was established in the state in 2014, and for children through 2019. Beginning with January 1st, 2014, States are also allowed to expand optional coverage to adults with incomes above 133% of poverty if their programs meet certain requirements, and some states have done that. The ACA also changed the method that states use for calculating income eligibility for many recipients. The ACA requires that states to use what's called Modified Adjusted Gross Income, or MAGI, to determine eligibility for Medicaid as of January 1st, 2014, without any income or expense disregards and without any asset tests. This standard does not apply to individuals eligible for Medicaid because of their eligibility in supplemental security income, people who are 65 or older, the medically needy, or individuals eligible for Medicare cost-sharing Medicaid benefits. These rules also do not apply for determining eligibility for people receiving nursing facility services or home and community-based services. Those people's eligibility are determined under the old standards. The ACA also extended the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, to September of 2015. CHIP covers children and families with incomes above 138% of the poverty level, and in some states up to 400% of the poverty level. It currently covers 8 million children, including many children of parents who are themselves covered through the exchanges with premium tax credits. Beginning in October of 2015, the ACA would increase the federal medical assistance percentage, the federal contribution for CHIP, by 23 percentage points through September of 2019. This is, however, dependent upon Congress extending the CHIP program, which will otherwise expire in September of next year. States may not put into effect more restrictive eligibility standards for CHIP than they already had at the time the statute was adopted until September of 2019. If the state CHIP fund allotments are not adequate to provide coverage for eligible children, a state must make sure that its children who are not covered are provided coverage through the exchange. Beginning in January 1st, 2014, CHIP eligibility is being determined using MAGI, just like Medicaid eligibility is and eligibility for the premium tax credits. Children who lose Medicaid eligibility because of the elimination of income disregards will be eligible for CHIP. There's a serious debate at this point as to whether CHIP should be extended beyond next year. It's argued that children in CHIP should be moved to the exchanges where they would be covered under the same coverage as their parents using the same providers. On the other hand, it is argued that CHIP is an established program that works well and meets the needs of children and should be maintained until we're really certain that the private insurance exchanges are fully functional. So that debate is going to be a big debate over the next year. The ACA increased Medicaid payments for family and general internal medicine practitioners and for pediatricians providing primary care services to 100% of the Medicare payment levels for 2013 and 2014, with 100% federal match for the increased expenditures. Medicaid expansions means little if there are no practitioners to care for Medicaid recipients. So this provision is playing a vital role in making Medicaid work. Medicaid often pays much less than Medicare or private insurance, and so the hope was that this provision would bring practitioners into the Medicaid program that might not otherwise have accepted patients. Unfortunately, that provision was limited to 2 years and has been slow getting implemented. I saw the other day, though, that a number of states now have extended the 100% payment beyond its expiration date at the end of this year. The ACA also attempted to simplify the enrollment process for Medicaid and CHIP, although this simplification is still not realized in a number of states. New enrollment simplifications allow Medicaid and CHIP enrollment through the exchanges with a no wrong door approach, or at least they will hopefully at some point in the future. Whether an individual applies through the exchange or through a state agency, they should be enrolled in the correct program. Again, this program is not fully functional yet. The extent to which it is varies from state to state, but progress is being made. The law also significantly allows hospitals to make presumptive eligibility determinations for Medicaid. This is very important because it effectively makes Medicaid a catastrophic health insurance program for all persons who are eligible for it. People don't necessarily figure out how to apply for Medicaid or go to the trouble of doing it, particularly if they have a full-time job and child care responsibilities and don't have the time. However, if they do get really sick and show up at the hospital can immediately presumptively enroll them in Medicaid and get paid. And so whether or not they've enrolled before, it becomes a program that's there for them when they really need it. Medicaid benefits were also marginally expanded under the Affordable Care Act. It requires coverage for freestanding birth center services, allows children in hospice to concurrently receive Medicaid payment for services and for medical treatment in addition to the treatment of their terminal illness, and expands financial eligibility for payment for family planning services. The ACA also clarifies that medical assistance, that Medicaid requires provision of care and services as well as payment for the cost of care and services. Some states had argued in court cases that their Medicaid programs only had a responsibility to pay for services and no responsibility at all to find providers to provide them. The ACA contains a number of other provisions directed towards keeping patients in the community and out of nursing homes, quite a number of these. The Community First Choice option, the Removing Barriers to Providing Home and Community-Based Services program, the extension of Money Follows the Person, rebalancing demonstration program. A new section provides that for the 5-year period beginning in 2014, the spouses of individuals receiving home and community-based care are subject to the same protections against impoverishment as are the spouses of institutionalized persons. So there's a real attempt in the Affordable Care Act to get people out of nursing homes into the community or keep people into the community rather than going into nursing homes. Some Medicaid provider payments were also cut by the Affordable Care Act. Drug companies were required to pay higher rebates, and Medicaid and Medicare disproportionate share hospital payments, which had previously covered hospitals' uncompensated care losses, were also cut, given the assumption, which is turning out to be true in some states, that the expansion of insurance coverage would reduce uncompensated care. There have been a number of reports in the last few weeks that hospitals in states that have done the Medicaid expansion are showing much better financial health, lower medical debt. States in Virginia that haven't yet expanded Medicaid, hospitals, and some of them are closing or are experiencing real problems. The ACA contains a number of provisions and demonstration projects also for coordinating care of dual eligibles, people who are eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid, and as well as improving the quality of care for Medicaid recipients. These include demonstration projects for pediatric accountable care organizations, global payment systems, and integrated care around hospitalizations. They also include a state option for allowing health homes for enrollees with chronic conditions and payment adjustments for hospital-acquired conditions. I think we're going to hear more a little bit about the various incentives that the Affordable Care Act creates for providers to improve the care for poor people. The ACA also adds a new program to provide support for pregnant and parenting teens and women, funded at $25 million a year for 10 years. The Medicaid and Medicare Innovation Center is supposed to spur innovative approaches to delivery and paying for the care for Medicaid and Medicare. Last month, CMS announced the availability of $100 million for a new Medicaid Innovation Accelerator program to identify and improve models for the delivery and payment for care, including data analysis and quality measurement and improving dissemination of best practices. This is, again, one of only a number of programs encouraging innovation in Medicaid. Many of these programs are now in effect, but the most important of these initiatives, it's not yet fully in place. On the day that the ACA was signed into law, a number of states, eventually 26, filed a lawsuit attacking key provisions of the law. One of these was the Medicaid extension. The state challengers claimed that the ACA Medicaid amendments crossed a constitutional line. It is clear that Congress cannot force the states to participate in a federal program. The courts have long recognized, however, that the federal government can offer funding to the states conditional upon them satisfying program requirements for programs like Medicaid. The court had speculated in earlier cases a couple of times that a situation could arise in which the financial inducement offered by Congress was so coercive that pressure would turn into compulsion. But no federal court at any level had ever before held that a federal law failed this test. And the lower courts, both the District Court and the Court of Appeals, that were otherwise quite hostile to the Affordable Care Act, upheld the Medicaid expansion in the ACA cases. Chief Justice John Roberts, joined by Justices Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, and supported by a joint dissent joined by Justices Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito, held that the ACA's Medicaid expansion crossed this constitutional line. The court claimed, moreover, that this coercion doctrine is fundamental to federalism and that brandishing federal funding to coerce states to participate in a federal program threatens the state's independent sovereignty. Because the Medicaid extension was established as a mandate, not an option, Medicaid law would, in theory, allow the Department of Health and Human Services to threaten to withhold all Medicaid payments from states not expanding, a penalty, by the way, that HHS has always had to enforce Medicaid program provisions and is never imposed. In the Florida case, however, the court held that such a response was impermissible. Withdrawal of program funding would amount to unconstitutional coercion, given the program size and nature of the expansion. On average, Medicaid accounts for more than 20% of total state budgets and represents the largest single source of federal funding for the states. Furthermore, said Roberts, the ACA Medicaid expansion changed Medicaid fundamentally. Medicaid, he claimed, is no longer a program to care for the neediest among us, but rather an element of a comprehensive national plan to provide universal health insurance coverage. Congress could not constitutionally force the states to implement a new program under the threat of losing existing funding. Having found that the Medicaid expansion was unconstitutional, however, the court did not strike the expansion as the dissenters wished. Instead, it simply prevented HHS from enforcing the expansion as a mandate. The practical effect of this is to turn it into an option, although the law on the books remains unchanged. At the same time, the court made clear that Congress has the power to delineate the conditions under which the states can receive new expansion funding. The court's decision raised questions as to how far it went. As I've described, the ACA makes many changes in the Medicaid program. In particular, the law contains a maintenance of effort program barring states from rolling back their Medicaid eligibility requirements before 2014. It also requires other changes in coverage and enrollment. The states challenged the ACA's expansions of eligibility, including the maintenance of effort requirement and including other requirements. Roberts' opinion focused only on the expansion, never mentioning the other reforms. Presumably, the court considered them part of the existing program subject to Medicaid's normal enforcement requirements for mandatory provisions. HHS subsequently made clear that where Medicaid is concerned, the Roberts ruling is confined only to the expansion requirement. In the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling, 27 states, including the District of Columbia, have decided to move forward with Medicaid expansion. About 20 are not moving forward at this time, and in 4, the debate continues. And of course, as you know, in Virginia, we have not so far decided to move forward. Actually, the debate continues really in all of the states that have not yet expanded. And it's important to remember that in the first year Medicaid it was established, I think only about a half dozen or so states participated. And every time it's expanded and expansions have been optional, there's been some delay in expanding as well. The CHIP program wasn't expanded immediately when it was signed into law. So there's hope here that the states will expand once they work through the political problems that are causing some states not to expand at this point. Although most of the blue states adopted the Medicaid expansion as written, some of the red states have tried to chart their own path. This is done through what's called the 1115 waiver process. Section 1115 of the Social Security Act allows the Secretary of Health and Human Services to waive certain requirements of the Social Security Act programs, including Medicaid, to allow research and demonstration projects. These have been quite liberally granted in the past, and these so-called demonstration and research projects have continued for years, becoming effectively substitute programs. I think we're now at about the 30th anniversary of Arizona having set up a research and demonstration project, and I guess they're still trying to figure out whether it works. The demonstration projects tend to try to increase cost sharing and impose additional eligibility requirements with the goal of encouraging individual responsibility. Some of these changes are legally possible, but HHS has been cautious, and a number of the states are trying to negotiate their own approach to Medicaid with HHS. So far, Arkansas, Iowa, and Michigan have been successful. Pennsylvania, Indiana, there might be a couple of other states continue to try to negotiate with HHS. Excuse me? I thought there was a problem with the sound. Okay. One of the kinds of requirements that states have been talking about is increasing cost sharing for Medicaid recipients. And I think you just wonder sometimes, have any of these people ever met a poor person? Deductibles, out of the question. If you're wondering how you're going to get your next meal and what food pantry is open today, to put down a $20 copay or, God forbid, a $500 deductible, that just means you don't get health care. You might as well just forget about it. And so some of these programs, I think, are very problematic. Surveys show that the country is heading down two radically different paths at this point. In states that have accepted the Medicaid expansion, the program is growing rapidly. In states that expanded Medicaid under the ACA, enrollment has, as of May, increased on average 17%, with increased enrollment of 30% or more in 10 states. Enrollment in both Nevada and Oregon has increased by 50%. Non-expansion state enrollment has grown by only about 3%, with enrollments in Florida, Missouri, Mississippi, and Nebraska actually shrinking. The level of the uninsured is falling rapidly in expansion states, much more slowly in non-expansion states. 4.8 million Americans who could have received Medicaid are being denied coverage because they live in non-expansion states. And I'm just going to take a second to describe the situation of some friends of ours that we visited not too long ago who live maybe 50 miles from here. They operate a farm. They have sheep and horses. They're getting close to retirement age, but they're not there yet. They work very, very hard. Very hard. Up early in the morning taking care of the livestock, up late at night working with them. They have physical problems. They've been doing hard physical labor for decades. They were really looking forward to the Affordable Care Act because they've been uninsured for many years. When they went in to apply, they were told, given the expenses of your farm, your income is below the poverty level, and therefore in Virginia you're not eligible for help. So they're uninsured. The ACA not only helps the lowest income Americans, but also helps moderate income Americans, people who earn a little bit more than our friends. The ACA's primary strategy for expanding coverage for moderate income Americans is the Premium Assistance Tax Credit. Beginning this year, Americans earning up to 400% of the poverty level, which is about $46,000 for a family of one and $94,000 for a family of four, who purchase non-group or individual health insurance coverage through one of the exchanges established under the law, are eligible for a tax credit. The amount of the individual's tax credit is calculated on a monthly basis and is the lesser of, and this gets complicated, the monthly premium cost for the plan that they're enrolled in, or if it is less, which it usually is, the monthly premium for the second lowest cost silver plan, a silver plan being a plan with what's called a 70% actuarial value. It covers 70% on average of the medical costs of its enrollees. So they're covered for what it would cost had they bought the second lowest cost silver plan. Actually, most people either buy the lowest cost or the second lowest cost silver plan, so the premium tax credit usually is pretty significant. It covers the difference between that and 1/12 on a monthly basis of the annual income, of a percentage of the annual income of the person, which they then have to pay for the premium. So in other words, if your income is at 133% of poverty, you have to pay 2% of your annual income for premiums, and then the premium tax credits cover the rest. If your income is 400% of the poverty level, you have to pay 9.5% of your modified adjusted gross income for premiums, and then the premium tax credits cover the rest. The percentages will increase over time to reflect the growth in health insurance premiums relative to income, so that the share of premiums paid by individuals will remain more or less constant. That is to say, premiums generally increase at a faster rate than income generally, and if that continues to be true, the percentage of income that individuals will pay on premiums and the percentage of the government will pay will stay roughly equivalent to what the percentages are now. However, it does mean that people will have to, over time, spend more of their income on premiums. The premium tax credit is adjusted for age, as are the premiums. The cost of any benefits covered by an insurance policy beyond the essential health benefits are not considered in calculating the premium tax credit. And what that probably mainly applies to would be adult dental and vision care. Pediatric dental and vision care is covered. Persons who are eligible for Medicaid are not eligible for the premium tax credits. Neither are persons who are eligible for Medicare or incarcerated or undocumented aliens. Aliens legally present in the United States are not eligible for Medicaid usually until they've been present in the country for 5 years. These are legal immigrants. But they are eligible for the premium tax credits even though their income is below 100% of the poverty level. But United States citizens with incomes below 100% of the poverty level in states that reject the Medicaid expansion are not eligible for premium tax credits. Most persons who have employer coverage are not eligible for the premium tax credits. However, employees may be eligible to purchase individual coverage through an exchange with assistance with the premium tax credit if they're eligible for an employer-sponsored plan, but the employer coverage is either not affordable or not adequate. And coverage is not affordable if the employee's share of the premium would cost more than 9.5% of their income. It's not adequate if the plan does not cover at least 60% of projected medical costs over a population, does not have an actuarial value of 60%. Individuals and families who qualify for premium tax credits get pretty comprehensive coverage. Qualified health plans sold through the exchanges must cover the essential health benefits, which again cover most services used by most people other than adult dental and vision care. Cost sharing, however, can be very high. The deductibles under the bronze plan, which are the least expensive plan, average about $5,000, and benchmark silver plans, often the cost sharing can cost $2,500 or more. The deductible can be $2,500 or more. There is an out-of-pocket limit, but people often face pretty steep cost sharing until they reach that out-of-pocket limit. The reform legislation, however, provided not only for the tax credits to reduce the cost of the health insurance premiums, but also for direct payments to qualified health plans to reduce cost sharing, including deductibles, co-insurance, co-payments. Cost sharing is limited for plans available to individuals in two different ways. First, the legislation imposes a maximum out-of-pocket expenditure limit, basically equal to the limit imposed on high deductible policies that accompany health savings accounts under prior law. currently $6,350 for an individual, $12,700 for a family. Second, and those maximum out-of-pockets are reduced somewhat for individuals with incomes below 250% of poverty. Second, qualified health plans in the individual and small group market must offer coverage in specified actuarial value levels, which are denominated as the precious metal levels, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, ranging from 60 to 90% of actuarial value. Actually, and I've used this term actuarial value several times now, actuarial value is determined by the overall structure of the plan and does not dictate out-of-pocket expenses for any individual or family. A person who has a very expensive population may have to pay only a tiny fraction of the cost, whereas a person who maybe has 1 or 2 primary care visits a year may end up getting no value out of the insurance policy, may have to pay the full amount themselves. But on average, 30%, 40%, 20%, 10% of the costs have to be paid by the individual and the rest by the plan. The law also includes what are called cost-sharing reduction payments, which are payments made by the federal government directly to an insurer on behalf of an eligible individual to lower that individual's cost-sharing obligations. An eligible individual is a person who enrolls in a silver tier plan, the 70% actuarial value plan, in the individual market through the exchange and whose income is above 100% but below 400% of poverty. Cost-sharing reduction payments reduce the statutory out-of-pocket limit for persons with household incomes not exceeding 250% of the poverty level. These reductions in the out-of-pocket limit cannot increase the actuarial value of plans above the level specified in the statute. In addition, however, to the reduction in the out-of-pocket payments, which I'd already mentioned, cost-sharing subsidies also increase the actuarial value of the plans for low-income enrollees. Cost-sharing reduction subsidies must ensure that persons with incomes between 100 and 150% of poverty have coverage with an actuarial value of at least 94%, and persons with household incomes between 150 and 200% of the poverty level have coverage with actuarial value of at least 87%. What that means is that if your income is below 200% of poverty, your cost sharing is at your deductibles, your co-insurance, your co-payments are actually much lower than they would be for people with higher income, recognizing again that people with incomes in those levels cannot afford big deductibles or co-payments. Native Americans with household incomes not exceeding 300% of the poverty level are not responsible for any cost sharing. Affordable Care Act is really a good deal for Native Americans, and they've gotten a lot of bad deals over the years in the United States, but they do face much lower cost sharing than any other group. Enrollment in qualified health plans with premium tax credits got off to a slow start with the federal exchange, which covers 36 states, and state exchanges in many of the remaining states failing at the outset. By the end of the 2014 open enrollment period, however, over 8 million Americans had chosen a health plan through the exchanges, and probably 7 million of those paid their first premium and therefore actually qualified for coverage. I saw the other day that maybe 1 million more people have since qualified under special enrollment periods. Recent reports concur that the number of uninsured in the United States has been reduced dramatically since the beginning of this year. A recent Gallup poll shows that the percentage of the population that is uninsured is the lowest that it has been since they started polling, at 13.4%, down from 18% last year. A recent Urban Institute poll shows that the percentage of uninsured has dropped to 10% in states expanding Medicaid, although it's still at 18.3% in states that are not expanding Medicaid. Again, this huge divide between the red and the blue states. A recent Commonwealth Fund report finds that 9.5 million fewer people are uninsured than were a year ago, including 5.7 million young people. Many of these 87% of the 5.4 million Americans who chose a health plan through the federal federally facilitated health exchange qualified for some financial help. The average monthly premium tax credit this year is $264. Without the federal help, the average premium chosen by people eligible for a tax credit would have been $346 per month, but the subsidy lowers consumers' premiums on average by 76%. The result is that 4 out of 5 people with premium tax credit subsidies are paying premiums of no more than $100 a month for their health insurance. Many of these people may still be unable to afford actual health care because of high deductibles, but we don't yet know the extent to which cost-sharing reduction payments reduce these. Surely for many of the newly insured, cost-sharing reduction payments have been substantial. Medicaid, of course, has minimal cost-sharing in most states and therefore makes care much more accessible. The ACA also contains numerous other provisions that benefit low-income Americans. It creates a prevention and public health fund to provide for expanded national investment in prevention and public health. It establishes a new program for school-based health centers. It provides for competitive grants to states and communities for the implementation, evaluation, and dissemination of evidence-based community health activities and for a Healthy Aging Living Well program. It also creates programs to expand immunizations for adults and expands the collection of data on health disparities. It creates special programs for pain care management, for childhood obesity, for diabetes, for depression, for congenital heart disease. It creates workplace wellness program incentives and creates new programs for breast cancer in young women. Very importantly, the legislation included $10 billion in new appropriations for community health centers, which serve the new Medicaid recipients as well as immigrants excluded from the exchanges, and several billion more for the National Health Services Corps. Our community health center in Harrisonburg, where I live, has been dramatically expanded because of ACA payments. On balance, the ACA is improving the lives of lower-income Americans. A Brookings study found that it would raise the real income of the bottom 10th of the population by 7%, the bottom 5th by 6%. In states where Medicaid is expanded, the lowest income Americans have access to health coverage and health care. In all states, with Americans with incomes above 133% of the poverty line have better access to health insurance and in many instances to health care. It also, very importantly, increases financial security for lower and moderate income Americans. But it is not an improvement for all. For example, the ACA requires large employers to cover their full-time employees or pay a penalty. Full-time is defined as 30 hours or more on average. Some employers are cutting hours for part-time workers to avoid offering coverage, which results in some families earning less money. Due to what is referred to as the family glitch, if employees are offered affordable coverage, that is, employee-only coverage that costs less than 9% at 5% of their income, they and their families are not eligible for premium tax credits. Many low-income individuals, therefore, can find coverage affordable for themselves through their employer, but cannot afford coverage for their families either through their employer or through the exchanges. Moreover, it will take more than health reform to effectively address poverty in the United States or even to address health disparities. Differences in mortality and morbidity between low and high-income Americans are striking. Yet much of this difference is due to factors other than medical care. The things I talked about at the beginning of this talk. Problems with housing, with diet, with education, environmental risk differentials, occupational risk differentials, even stress. Health care is a substantial factor, but even in countries that have long had universal public health insurance, disparities between the rich and poor remain. The ACA in the end is not a cure for poverty, but it is certainly a significant move in the right direction. Thank you very much.